These enterprises enraged Catholic King Philip II, who, sanctioned by the Pope, claimed America for Spain. Regarding the French as interlopers, the fact that they were Protestants made them more intolerable. So in 1565, not before a Cuban expedition under Captain Hernando de Manrique de Roas destroyed Charles IV in May 1564, the Pope commissioned devout Catholic Admiral Pedro Menendez de Avilés of Asturias to rid Florida of the Huguenot menace. Menendez's orders were to leave not a man alive, inflict on the heretics an exemplary punishment which all of their kind will remember forever. His hatred was also fired by the fact that the Huguenots were determined to free the inhabitants of Cuba, who had been enslaved by the Spaniards. Despite kind help from the natives, internal problems and a delay of supplies from France, then in the grip of the First Religious War, meant that Fort Caroline was not looking a viable settlement. As desperation was setting in, ships under the command of Sir John Hawkins appeared in August 1565. Though offered a passage back to Europe, the French decided to accept a ship and supplies from the Protestant English in exchange for most of their cannon. Plans to abandon Fort Caroline ended when Ribault's second expedition brought supplies and reinforcements from France. Then, hard on the heels of Ribault's fleet, Menendez and his heresy hunters arrived off the Florida coast. Establishing a base at St. Augustine, named after the feast day of St. Augustine, he sailed north to oppose the French. After an inconclusive standoff in the St. John's estuary, Menendez returned to his base. Ribault and 500 of his men then sailed to attack St. Augustine. However, lashed by a hurricane, it was the hurricane season, shipwreck south of St. Augustine rendered Ribault's counter-offensive futile. A fortnight later, since there were few defenders, the Spaniards then attacked Fort Caroline overland. At dawn on the 20th of September 1565, Menendez and his men struck at the fort, inside which were women and children, all the sick, including René Ladonnière, and a handful of armed guards. Above 143 massacred bodies, Menendez placed a notice: "I do this not as to Frenchmen, but as to Lutherans." Besides taking supplies and ammunition, Protestant Bibles, books, and Reformed symbols were destroyed. Ladonnière and a few others escaped to tell the tale. Sailing in his ship the Greyhound, Ladonnière landed in Wales, in the port of Swansea, receiving succor from the people there before continuing back to France. He later wrote an account of Ribault's voyages and his martyrdom, an event we now relate. Tragically, with his vessels beached, Ribault and his men were eventually caught in the cruel grip of Menendez. The first group of survivors of his sunk and grounded ships tried to make their way overland to Fort Caroline, not knowing what had happened there. Scouts from St. Augustine observed them. Soon Menendez led 50 soldiers south to Anastasia Island. Surrounding the worn and bedraggled Huguenots, he offered to spare their lives if they would surrender. Battered by the sea and hungry, they agreed. After ordering their hands tied behind their backs, the Spaniard ferried his prisoners across the swamps to a place of execution. Soon 111 Huguenots lay dead in the sand. A second group headed by Ribault appeared a few days later. They too were slain, at the same location. It was later named Matanzas, meaning Spanish for slaughters. In all, nearly 250 died. What is truly remarkable is the way all these French Protestants, without exception, maintained their profession of the Reformed faith. Over 4,000 miles from home, in an unfamiliar foreign land, they did not capitulate in the face of death. What a testimony to God's all-sufficient sustaining grace. A Spaniard named Solis Dumeras was an eyewitness of the massacre. He said, "Menendez took Jean Ribault behind the sandhills among the bushes. He asked if they were Catholics or Lutherans, or if any of them desired to make confession. Jean Ribault replied that all who were there were of the new religion. And he began to repeat the psalm, Domine, memento mei. And having finished, he said that from dust they came and to dust they must return, and that in 20 years more or less he must render his final account, and that Menendez might do with them as he chose." We must note that Jean Ribault recited, or possibly chanted, the words of Psalm 132. Charles Bennett remarks that the psalm that Ribault recited before the dagger was thrust into his body was this psalm, which begins, "Lord, remember David." But Ribault began it, according to an eyewitness, with, "Lord, remember me." The psalm is highly significant, as David, anxious to build the temple, later built by Solomon, was concerned to find a resting place for the Ark of the Covenant and the pure worship of God. So Coligny, Ribault, and others desired to find a place in the New World to worship God in spirit and in truth, far from the superstitious and persecuting religion of Rome. Sadly, pursuing them across the Atlantic, their enemies gave them no peace, even in distant Florida. Thus, on that fatal September day in 1565, Ribault and around 250 others were America's first martyrs. Trusting to the certain purposes of their sovereign God, they knew, despite their fears, that their struggles and sufferings for Christ would never be in vain, a truth gloriously stated by John Calvin in his commentary on Psalm 132, where he says, "The greater that fear which seizes upon us when exposed to aggression from enemies, the more are we sensibly awakened to take hold of divine help. The passage teaches us that the Church and people of God will never enjoy such peace on earth as altogether to escape being assaulted by the variety of enemies which Satan stirs up for their destruction. It is enough to have it declared upon divine authority that their attempts shall be unsuccessful, and that they will retire eventually with ignominy and disgrace." And so it proved to be, as expressed by American poet James Russell Lowell, opponent of slavery and other injustices. "Careless seems the great avenger, history's pages but record. One death grapple in the darkness twixt old systems and the word. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own."